So I'm gonna just shoot straight. God's not a dude. What's up, y'all, and welcome to Durag Thoughts. My name is Trevor Went. I'm a visual artist based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, making art to challenge perspectives, give hope to the marginalized and oppressed. And this space right here, Durag Thoughts, is a space where we talk about topics that do just that, challenge perspectives and give hope to the marginalized and oppressed. And today I want to talk about this conversation of a topic that I hope widens your perspective of who God is and who God reveals God's self as. And that topic is that God is not a dude, that God is not male, that God is not a man, but God is, you gotta wait for that for a second, because I want to kind of set the stage. I want to kind of create a framework for what we're talking about. And so the God that I am speaking about and referring to is the God of the Christian faith, God that is known as Yahweh, or I am, Adonai, Elohim, God Most High, the triune God of the Bible that consists of God Most High, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And so this is the God that I'm speaking about, and the idea that this God is not a dude. Now, to be very clear, I am not saying that God is a woman either. I'm not saying that God is man or woman. And you might ask, why do I say that? And I believe that God sits far outside of our frameworks of maleness or femaleness, of men or women, because I think that God created men and women. And so I think that in the space that God has created these different categories, how can God sit in those frameworks to be encased in those? That's not to say that Jesus did not come in the form of a man, but I'll get to in a second why I think Jesus did that. But I believe that God is spirit, and I think that God reveals that to us through John the Apostle, who says in John 4 that God is spirit. So you might ask, okay, I get what you're saying, Trevor, but isn't God referred to as a man or God the Father or all these different things throughout the Bible? Didn't even Jesus call God the Father? And yes, but I think there's a reason for this. I think that people believe that God is a dude for many good reasons, because that's the language that they were given. All throughout the Old Testament, we see God referred to as a dude and used with male dominated language of these he's and all these different things. And like I said, Jesus refers to God as God the Father, even in his ministry. So what do I make of this? Why did this happen? Why is this way? So I want to ask you a question before we dive into that. Do you think that God has a penis? And if God does have a penis, if you do believe that, then what would God need a penis for? Think about the reasons that penises exist. If you think about that, I don't really think that God would have a need for that. And I don't think you, as you reason through those things, would think that either. And so I think that God, who creates from an autonomous space, doesn't really have a need for a penis. See, most people would identify and align with the ideology that God does not have a gender because God is beyond gender, that God is just God. So why the maleness? Why refer to God as a male throughout all these different spaces of time? And here are my thoughts on this. There were patriarchal societies throughout the entire, well, the patriarchal societies still exist now, but the patriarchal societies of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, of the ancient Near East, had very, 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 very low views of women. Women were viewed super, super low on the totem pole. If you don't know about this, just do a little bit of history work. I mean, I'm sure within elementary school, middle school, and grade school, like all throughout grade school, you learned about Rome and all these different places where women were kind of viewed in a space of a belonging, that it was like even the women and children kind of thing. I think that in these spaces, it would have been counterproductive to try to refer to God as a woman. Now, that's not to say that there weren't societies that had goddesses, but I don't think most of the societies had women as the top God figure within their societies, at least in the framework that we're working in within the ancient Near East. Now you've got Hinduism and things like that might have a different perspective on those things. But within the ancient Near East, with the Hebrew people, the Jewish faith that led into the Christian faith, these weren't really the frameworks that they were working within. I think also this kind of plays into Jesus's narrative of why Jesus had to come as a man, came in the form of man. We see that language all throughout the New Testament, that Jesus came in the form of man, was the God-man, fully God, fully man. Why was Jesus on the male front? Well, I think it's because Jesus wouldn't have got the work done that he needed to get done if he would not have come as a man. Because that's the society he lived in. No one would listen to him. He couldn't have been a rabbi. He couldn't have done the work that he needed to do in the form of a woman in that space. I think this is also the reason that we see Jesus appoint 12 disciples, because Jesus couldn't have appointed 10 male disciples and 2 women, or 5 women and 5 men, or anything like that, because he would not have had the credit that he would needed to do what he needed to do. He would not have been able to get further in the society because of the ways that people viewed women. I think Jesus gets around this by empowering women in various ways throughout his ministry. Jesus treated women in radical ways that would have been totally and were totally out of line in their understandings. And I think Jesus combats the times and how they viewed women in those ways, but it wasn't a time where he could elevate women to the status of who became the apostles. So I think that's why we see some of those things happen in the ancient Near East, and why God is revealed to as male all throughout these different spaces. Because here's the grandiose scope of things. Like, God is God. We talked about this earlier. God is spirit. And so God kind of sits beyond these things, and really these categories are just analogies. They're just analogies to help us understand, or better understand, the personhood of God. If we look in these different spaces, God the Father, Father suggests something about the character of God to help us understand who God is. Or, we have a completely different space, like God being, compared to a consuming fire. Well, we got the moment of Moses in the burning bush to kind of see God, coming in the form of a fire and talking to Moses, which is wild. But God, I would argue that most people would probably argue that God is not just some flame that's just flickering around all the time, but rather God is, person. God is spirit. God is something beyond that. But it is a analogy to help us understand the power, the fullness, and the scope of who God is. Or even on the other side of things, in the space that I want to kind of dive into today, in Matthew 23, we see Jesus, or God, referred to or compared to a mother hen, caring for her young, protecting her young. And this denotes something very specific about God to help us get a grasp or understanding, wrap our heads around who the person of God actually is. So all this stuff is they're just analogies. They're just ways to help us get a better grasp on God and better understand God from our finite and, although very powerful, human minds, but human minds that can't understand the scope of the supernatural, of the person of God. So you might be wondering, all right, bro, why does this even matter? Like, why are we even talking about this? Like I said, analogies are meant to help us understand. And I think women analogies help us to better understand and grasp a fuller perspective of who God is. I think analogies in and of themselves should help us wrap our heads around who God is, and we cannot take the analogies of God as a mother, God as a woman, God as female outside of these spaces. The God who is able to empathize with women in their struggles and in their triumphs, all these different things, we need that God. A God who can have motherly characteristics, like Things maybe like compassion or motherly instincts or protection, comfort, these different things. The nurturing aspect of a mother, to think about those things when we think about God training us up, and all those different ways that we can kind of help, or the things that can help us understand God better. I think that these are all things, like I said, that are helpful in understanding God. I think, like I said, when you look at the analogy of God the Father, there are things that denotes that help us get a fuller perspective of God, just as if we look at God as mother. Genderless analogies even help us to get a fuller grasp of who God is, because genderless analogies help us to shape or understand who God is outside of the concept of what we can understand. That God is far beyond our understanding, which can help us walk into the spaces of reverence or, just awe and worship of God. So here are some examples of how I use these different aspects of, referring to God in these different ways to kind of help develop my faith and develop the way that I see and communicate and connect with God. When I sing, songs in services and church services, if the song is talking about God as a dude or God as father or something, such as, like, for instance, John Mark McMillan's King of My Heart. Sometimes I'll sing, let the queen of my heart, you be the fountain I drink from, or whatever that song says in that lyric. Or I'll say, in a song that might say God the Father, that might say, like, Father, you're all we need. Mother, you are all we need. Or God, you are all that I need. And if I switch back and forth to those different, descriptors of God, it will help me put my head in different spaces of who God is when I am singing and processing through and worshiping God through song. When I pray, sometimes I'll start a prayer off with Mother God instead of starting a prayer off with Father God or just God or whatever else, because Mother God helps me grab a fuller perspective of who God is and talk to God in a specific way that can kind of help me zone in a little bit more and help me get a grasp of a little bit more of who God is as I pray. Or if you've ever seen me create something, whether it is speaking or writing, or if you've seen me create video content that kind of sits in the space of, Christian church work, I will use and always refer to God as God's self. I won't say God and then say him or her. I'll just say God's self, because I think that this helps us wrap our heads around that God is beyond our concept of understanding and doesn't put God in a box of him or hers gendering God in some sort of way. But I think God sits outside of that, because God is spirit. Now, we don't have no sort of pronoun or anything for spirit, but if somebody has a pronoun for spirit that they can add to the English language and put in Webster's or whatever else, do it and I'll use it. A spear or whatever it gets called. You let me know. You can put it in the comments if you got some sort of, pronoun for spirit, that I'll use that. But for now, God is God's self, because the only pronoun that can describe the fullness of God is God's self to me, and maybe to others too. I think this emphasis also beyond maleness is super, super important in our culture because of what we rock through, what we're kind of wrestling through in our culture, and the conversations that are happening right now around the concepts of toxic masculinity or harmfulness of patriarchy and all those different spaces. And not that human flaws can disrupt or discredit the fullness of who God is and God's personhood, but I think that there's importance for us to kind of help shape and give people a fuller perspective of the person of God. We walk in the space of the Me Too and Church Too movements, and how women have been deeply hurt, and men too, but many people have been deeply hurt by male instituted oppression and harm, sexual abuse and sexual assault. And I think it's increasingly important in our time to drive into these analogies to help to move God beyond the concept of maleness. that move God into a grander perspective that shows God as a woman, God as mother, God as queen, God as all these different things, God as ruler. But also foremost that we show the goodness of God as God. We can show the grandiose nature of God and show all the different ways that in these different analogies to help us wrap our head around God, whether father, mother, king, ruler, queen, but in the grandiose perspective to help us to center in upon that God is beyond these analogies, that God is just God. And so, take reverence and understand, hey, regardless of what a man or a woman or whoever else did to me, God is in God's own separate category. And we can honor that, find rest in that, and find peace in the wholeness and the fullness of God. So I want to challenge you. Think about God beyond just God as a man, but think about, the analogies that can help widen your framework of who God is. So what are your thoughts on this? What do you think about referring to God in these different spaces of analogies? Let me know in the comments. If you got pushback against this, you can also throw it in the comments. I'm not afraid of that. Let's rock. But let me know in the comments below. Also, like, subscribe, share, all those things. Make sure you hit that notification bell situation so that you can get notified anytime a new video is dropping. And we'll have new stuff coming in all sorts of different realms soon. So that's it for today. I'll talk to y'all soon. Be easy.